360 North, in collaboration with the Arctic Ecosystem Integrated Survey, presents Below the Surface, diving deep into the science of maritime change in the Arctic, with funding support from the Alaska Community Coastal Impact Assistance Program.
Hello, and welcome to a unique program about ongoing marine research in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. Below the Surface, diving deep into the science of maritime change in the Arctic, is about a research program called the Arctic Ecosystem Integrated Survey, or Arctic EIS. EIS is actually the spelling for the German word for ice, which is why it's also referred to as Arctic ice. And we have 4 people with us today who have participated in the initial round of research in 2012 and 2013 to document the marine life and the ocean conditions in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. At the far left, we have with us Dr. Franz Mueter, Associate Professor of Fisheries at the University of Alaska Fairbanks School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. And then next to him, we have Dr. Ed Farley with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Next to him is Dr. Kathy Kulitz with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Lauren Devine, PhD candidate in marine biology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Welcome, and thanks for coming in. We're going to start with the brief presentations from each of the 4, and then follow that up with a discussion, and we'll start with you, Dr. Mueter. Go ahead, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, this is about a project that we did a few years ago, as you mentioned, called the Arctic Ecosystem Integrated Survey that took us up into the northern Bering Sea and Chukchi Sea. There'd been quite a bit of sampling in the past for oceanographic conditions and some fishery surveys and other surveys, but this was really the first comprehensive multi-year oceanographic and fishery survey in Alaska's Arctic, and was conducted over a couple years in late summer of 2012 and 2013. And our main goal was really to try to understand the distribution of marine fishes and shellfishes in particular, and their food, plankton and other organisms that they rely on. This kind of shows the study region here, which is the northern Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea to the north, connected by Bering Strait. And a couple things I want to point out here is that the entire area is very shallow. So most of the bluish and white colors here are well under 200 feet deep, not a very deep ocean, which means that it turns over every winter and gets very cold top to bottom. And then most of the currents in this region, for example, the Alaska Coastal Current on the Alaska side and the Anadyr Current on the Russian side, flow northward through Bering Strait. So there's a big inflow of water and all the associated organisms through Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea. On the right here are the sampling locations in all the stations that we sampled systematically north to south or south to north in 2012 and 2013. The kind of sampling that we did was truly integrative in the sense that we sampled everything from the physical properties of the water using a water sampler like the one shown here, through the biology, and that included plankton nets for sampling zooplankton and different types of trawl gear, both a surface trawl and a bottom trawl for collecting organisms in the water column and on the bottom. And we also used sonar acoustics to look at organisms in the midwater. And then finally we had a seabird observer on board who counted and identified seabirds and also mammals. I'm a fisheries biologist, so I'm particularly interested in the fish, and some of the species of interest here are the 3 at the top here that were identified as species of potentially commercial importance in the Arctic, and that's Arctic cod, related to the, what you might eat as fish and chips, Pacific cod, the saffron cod, and the snow crab, a number of forage species, including things like capelin or hooligan and Pacific herring, and then several of the salmon species that also occur up there, particularly Chinook, chum, and pink salmon. I'm particularly interested in Arctic cod because they really play a central role in Arctic marine food webs. They concentrate sort of the plankton food and then basically act as a transfer of energy from the plankton to things like seabirds, marine mammals, including seals, beluga whales, and ultimately polar bears. And of course, a lot of those ultimately serve as subsistence food for some of the coastal communities in that area. What makes them very important in part is they have a very high fat content, so they're really good food for other organisms. Here, this shows a range of fat content for a number of species in that area, and Pacific herring are high in fat, they're good food, and both the adult Arctic cod and the small ones, the juveniles here highlighted in red, have also a very high fat content, so they really provide good food for other species. One of the things that we found in both of those years is where the juvenile fish actually are. So we knew very little about their life history up to that point. You know, we still don't know really where they spawn. We don't know where they go after their first summer and where they overwinter. But we did find, using sonar really, very high concentrations as indicated in the red colors here of juvenile Arctic cod in the northern part of the Chukchi Sea, which is Hannah Shoals area and some of the oil lease areas actually in that region. So very high concentrations, high densities of these juvenile cod there. But you know, we're also looking at this in a larger context. So the blue square here is our study region, but of course what happens there is linked to what is happening in general in the Arctic, and as many of you probably know, is the ice in the Arctic, the multi-year ice is shrinking rapidly. So in yellow here, this shows the yearly average ice minimum over the past 3 decades or so, and then in white, the ice cover in 2012, and it's been fairly similar in recent years. 2012 was the minimum so far. And the fact that that ice is, is far less in the summer and that it melts earlier in the spring has potentially profound effects on the biology in that region. And we're trying to understand what might that do to fish like Arctic cod and other fish like salmon. And Ed will tell you about the salmon a little bit.
All right, thanks, Franz. So Franz mentioned salmon is one of the species, the focal species that we've been looking at. And this is one of the species, or the salmon, are some of the species that I am particularly interested in, and how climate might impact their distribution and abundance in the Arctic. And we know that salmon have been in the Arctic for quite some time. It's just that they aren't very abundant at this time. But what's going to happen in the future, as Franz pointed out, we're seeing that there's been some loss of sea ice, and there's also going to be some ocean warming. If you look on the left-hand side here, that's under the current summer temperatures. You can see the sea ice there in white, and the greens and the blues show that the ocean temperatures are pretty cool at this time. But however, if you look at the projected temperatures into the future based on the climate scenarios, it looks like in the summertime, by the end of the century, ice will likely not be present up in the Arctic, and the water is going to warm up substantially as compared to now. So what does this warming mean for salmon in the Arctic? Well, one of the things that we've already noticed from some of the science that's been conducted up there is if you look at what happens when you have more open water during the summer season, less sea ice but more open water, we could see that that open water has been increasing if you look on the left-hand side from 1998 all the way to about 2010. And when we get more open water, we get more annual net primary production. And that primary production is what fuels the food in the ecosystem that's going to the fish and other seabirds and mammals. But it's very cold currently up in the Chukchi Sea, so a lot of that production that you see is falling to the bottom. This is just an example of what we would have caught on the bottom compared to what we catch in the midwater or surface. You can see that catches in the bottom are quite large. A lot of this is brittle stars, snow crab, which are going to be talked about later. And the catches in the midwater for fish are pretty small at this moment, but as the water begins to warm up, we think that more of that primary productivity is going to stay up in the upper part of the water column, helping to fuel the fish production. So juvenile salmon, this is the juveniles are the salmon that leave fresh water, so it's their first year in the ocean. We typically find these that life history stage in the top 20 meters of the water column. So it's really this warming and this potential for increased productivity that is going to help fuel some of the salmon production. So this is just an example of what we've seen. We described the 2012 and 2013 surveys, but NOAA's been up there in 2007. The Alaska Fisheries Science Center did a survey up there. So one of the things we noted, these are summer temperatures, is that 2007 was quite a bit warmer than the period in 12 and 13 when we were out sampling. And the other thing that we noticed in 7 was that primary production was a lot higher than it was in 12 and 13. And although I don't have a figure to show you here, we also found that there were a lot more zooplankton, and these zooplankton are the prey that the salmon are feeding on. So 7 seemed to be very special. It was warm, more primary productivity up in the water column, and more zooplankton. And what we found is when we did our surface trawling that there were more juvenile pink salmon up there in 2007 than in 12 and 13. So those X's that you see there are places that we sampled, but we did not catch any juvenile pinks. Those yellow dots on 2007 are catch peanut effort. And you can see that in that year there were a lot more juvenile salmon out there than there was in 2012 and 13. And what that translated into was those juvenile fish, pink salmon, spend 1 year in the ocean, and they came back the next year in fairly high numbers to Elson Lagoon in Barrow. In fact, it was pretty high. This is the reports of salmon harvest. This is from subsistence fisheries in Elson Lagoon. They reported about 95% of that in 2008 was pink salmon. We believe we captured a moment up in the Arctic where the conditions were just right for pink salmon to have high production and come back in high numbers.
Thank you. So, my name is Kathy Kulitz. I'm with Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the PI for the seabird component of this project, but I did want to point out that for this project, the person who did all the field work and who worked at most of the data is graduate student Catherine Pham, and she's with the Hawaii Pacific University. So our main objectives were to look at seabird distribution and abundance and to examine interannual variability relative to oceanographic and prey conditions that were collected simultaneously with this, during this project. So first, why study seabirds? Because they're not economically valuable like many of the fish that we've been talking about. But they're abundant predators. They do eat juveniles of some of the commercially important fish and also the ecologically important fish, as well as adults of other fish and the zooplankton. We have limited knowledge about their Arctic distributions and really about their ecology in general in the Arctic, especially after the breeding season when this project occurred in summer and fall. They're susceptible to human impacts like oil spills and vessel traffic. They are also sensitive bioindicators because they rely on the ocean for their food and they come back to breed on land and they're easily counted at sea. They make for good indicators. So we were looking for them visually as we transited among the different stations there. So, and basically we saw around 32 to 34 species out there during those 2 years, but only about 10 of those species make up 95% of the seabirds that we see out there. And in fact, really about the top 6 that you see under that pie chart there. We like to divide the birds up into feeding guilds based on what they eat or how they forage, and we talk, but there is a lot of crossover. Birds will eat a variety of things, they'll switch prey, but we have planktivores that eat plankton, piscivores, fish-eating birds, omnivores, which really are true omnivores. They eat anything, anytime, whatever they can find, and then the benthic species, which we didn't see much of because we were offshore. Those are the sea ducks that eat off the bottom. Now, the species shown in the pie chart there are some of the most important ones numerically. That's the least auklets on the top in the blue, and then the crested auklet in the red. They nest in the North Bering Sea, but they come up to the Chukchi Sea to feed after breeding. And then they breed in the general area. The short-tailed shearwater also make up a large part of our avifauna up there. They come from Australia, though. They come up to feed in their non-breeding season. So planktivores obviously are a huge component of the number of birds that we see up there. Now, just as an example, I wanted to talk about this, one of the more abundant species, that's the least auklet. They're planktivores. Shown in the 2012 map there, you can see that we had, there's a lot obviously in the North Bering Sea. They have breeding colonies down there off of St. Lawrence Island and the Diomedes and some other islands there. But they are also quite abundant up in the Chukchi, both the southern and northern Chukchi Sea. In 2013, there are much lower numbers in the Chukchi Sea. And that was true for a lot of the, particularly the planktivores, that we had abundant numbers up in the Chukchi in 2012 and not in 2013. Now, some of the fish eaters also showed sort of an opposite trend there. So we know that that salinity and temperature was important for these birds, and water depth. We've done models to figure out what best predicts where they might occur. But obviously prey is an important factor, and this graphic on the map that shows 2012 distribution for least auklets, again, maps the red dots show where the birds occurred, and then the green and yellow shows high concentrations of total biomass of zooplankton. So these guys eat copepods mainly, sometimes krill or euphausids, and so they are obviously following the prey to some degree, at some scale. But what we are really trying to get at is the change in seabird communities that's happening up in the Arctic, and that is a large part of what Catherine Pham's looking at. She's looking at what birds are found together and what type of habitats are found in and what kind of prey they associate with. We found strong longitudinal and latitudinal gradients, but also interannual variability. The picture of the birds there are the shearwaters moving in. And they don't breed in the area, but they come up to feed there. There must be a lot of good food for these birds to come up there late in the summer and fall, because they're flying thousands and thousands of miles. So looking at it in three basic areas. We have the North Chukchi Sea is the blue on the top, and then the South Chukchi Sea, and then the North Bering Sea. So we found, and those lines you see there are our transit lines that were done in between all the stations. So now we're going to start looking at more fine-scale associations between the seabirds and their prey. And in fact, seabird community has changed, especially up in the Chukchi in over the last 30 years or so. There are a lot more plankton feeders up there. And that's one of the things we want to look at, is how that might change in the future as conditions change. Okay.
All right, my name is Lauren Devine, and I am a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I worked on Arctic snow crab in the Chukchi Sea. Me on the left, and then my collaborators, my advisor, Katrin Eichen and Bodell Bloom, they're getting in the mud, because when you work on the bottom of the ocean, that is what you're dealing with. So I looked at Arctic snow crab, and when you think of snow crab, you think of Bering Sea commercial fisheries, but there's a lot of unknowns surrounding Arctic snow crab in the Chukchi as well as the Beaufort Sea, and I worked in both of those seas for this project. So kind of following my methods, I looked at a variety of different things concerning snow crabs in the Arctic. One of those was what their role is in the food webs. We heard from Ed how production falls from the water column down to the bottom of the ocean, and that feeds a lot of different organisms on the bottom of the ocean, including snow crabs. So I wanted to see what snow crabs were eating, as well as what's eating snow crabs in that region, because we really didn't know. This is kind of what it looks like to be out on the ocean. You pull up a trawl and dump everything on the table, and then you pick the snow crabs out. I then took those back to the lab, where I took them apart. So here is the insides of a snow crab, in case anyone's wondering. And to look at what they're eating, we took out their stomachs, which is the upside down triangle right behind the eyes that you see there. And we opened those up and looked at everything that was inside, and it's kind of a detective game to see what parts and pieces you can identify to look at what snow crabs are eating. So that addressed looking at diets of snow crabs, and then I also looked at some population distribution that I'll talk about in just a second. But to look at what snow crabs are eating, I have some images on the right there. The top is pieces of a clam or bivalves. The next picture in the middle is actually another snow crab. It's the crab chela and eye stalk of a smaller snow crab. So they are cannibalistic, and they do eat each other. And then the bottom picture is the otolith, or the ear bones, out of a fish. So they scavenge fish off the bottom of the ocean as well. And snow crabs really eat anything they can get a hold of. In addition to what they're eating, they provide food for bottom fishes, flatfishes, and sculpins that occur across the Chukchi Sea, and then they also move up the food web into marine mammals like bearded seals. We also looked at the distribution of snow crab, and particularly how many snow crabs are there and where are they occurring across the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. The Chukchi Sea is very shallow. We heard that earlier. It's a broad shelf. The Beaufort looks very different. It's a very narrow shelf, and it gets deep very quickly. However, we find Arctic snow crab in both of these locations. So what I wanted to look at was a comparison. In 2009, there was an Arctic Fisheries Management Plan that was released. And although we have no commercial fishing in the Arctic at present for any species on a commercial scale, snow crab are one of those species of interest in the future for a fishery. So there was an exercise to look at the biomass of snow crab in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea, and the numbers there in that first column from the Arctic Fisheries Management Plan were kind of a first guess of how much snow crab there are in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. So I compiled a bunch of information, including information that we gathered from the Arctic Ice Cruise, as well as 19 other cruises in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea, and reran the numbers to look at biomass. And what I found was a lower biomass in the Beaufort Sea and none in the Chukchi Sea. So to kind of put that into perspective, when we think of snow crab as a fishery, we think of the picture on the left. And if you think of the size of that snow crab as being probably as big as your hand is, and compare that with the image on the right, where this is someone holding maybe 100 or more snow crabs that were pulled out of the Chukchi Sea. So the scale of crabs that we're finding in the Chukchi Sea are much smaller than in the Bering Sea, where they're commercially fished.
Okay, great, thank you. And Dr. Meter, let me start with you. I want to focus on the word integrated and ecosystem integrated survey. How is this research different from other research projects in the area?
Yeah, these kinds of, a lot of the work that's being done is often kind of piecemeal, and people look at certain aspects of the ecosystem, and the integration here really occurs primarily across disciplines. So we tried to provide a platform for scientists to go out on to do work that encompasses physical oceanography, to look at the water properties, to look at the water circulation, to look at nutrient concentrations, so chemical oceanographers to study nutrient concentrations and water quality, to biologists who study plankton or fish or seabirds. So the integration is across different disciplines, and what that allows us to do is to link the different pieces together and to link, for example, fish distributions to the distribution of their prey or to the water quality or water conditions.
So for example, many of these scientists from all disciplines may be on that one particular boat as it's going through all these different transects and sampling and so forth. Is that right?
Yes, we're trying to get people with different expertise on the boat to be able to do all the work, and we collect the data on the boat, and then it goes out to the lab where lots of other disciplines may get involved to look at, for example, energetic condition or the age or other aspects of fish and snow crab.
And Dr. Farley, how many scientists were involved in this project?
We had, at the minimum, about 40 scientists. As Franz had pointed out, this is a real integrated effort. So you have physical oceanographers, chemical oceanographers, folks who study the biological oceanography, all the way up to fishes and then seabirds. So it's quite a large team to pull that all off.
But not everybody was riding on the boat, right?
No, the vessel that we had room for 6 scientists.
Now, is this a benchmark or a baseline survey? And can you explain the difference? Dr. Meter.
Well, typically when people talk about a baseline survey, they think of establishing a baseline sort of pristine conditions maybe, or the original condition. And that's what we used to call this type of survey, but in recognition of the fact that there already have been a number of changes occurring in that region, we typically refer to this as a benchmark now. So it gives us a measure of current conditions, whether they are pristine in any sense or whether they're already modified, to compare to future conditions. So we have a standard that we can compare it against. So typically we refer to it as a benchmark.
And Dr. Kulitz, we have a video of some birds that were also spotted during some of the cruises here, and I wondered if you could describe to us how you go about observing birds. How do you spot them? What's the process like?
We have a protocol that's fairly well established now. We have someone sitting up at the bridge, one person. They're using their eyes, for the most part, looking out straight ahead and 90 degrees out, and using binoculars for species identification. They'll get a distance, sometimes, depending on what type of protocol we're using, an angle to the bird, and then it's all connected. We enter it right directly into a laptop, which is connected to the ship's GPS, and in that sense we have a lat long for every observation we make. It's also automatically recording at 20-second intervals, getting a location so we can have our track line of how often, what our actual effort is, and then we're able to convert those numbers. We also figure out a detection curves, because little birds are harder to see than big birds. Figure out birds per kilometer square. And then we're able to overlay that with what the other people are finding in terms of oceanography and plankton and fish.
And how do you go about identifying birds from a distance? I mean, they may be hundreds of yards
Very
away.
different from looking at a bird just sitting on the water near you often. You're in a big boat, you're often moving fairly quickly. And it's a skill, it's an art, and I hire people that know their birds well and are actually passionate usually about that, the birds, and we often train. We train when we're not on the ship, and then we also sometimes go on boats where we have two spots, so we train people on the ship. And it is different. You get to learn how they fly, what kinds of group patterns they make, how close to the water they fly. So there are patterns that you can pick up. It's very different from using a book to ID a bird in the hand.
But it wasn't just birds, you also identified and
Right,
observed.
we also recorded marine mammals. We don't use a marine mammal protocol. Is quite different. We're looking very close to the boat, and marine mammals often are looking off to the horizon. But we can get information on distribution of key species.
Now, Lauren Devine, we also have a video of a helmet crab that was sampled during the cruise, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the differences in the abundance and size of the snow crab in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. You kind of alluded a little bit to it, but can you get into more detail?
Absolutely, yep. The Chukchi and Beaufort are very different, and what we find is, as I showed earlier, tons and tons of very small snow crab in the Chukchi Sea. They're very abundant there. In the Beaufort Sea, we run across them very rarely, but they are commercial size. So we are seeing large commercial size crabs in the Beaufort Sea. They're at deeper depths, and honestly, we're not entirely sure what the reasons are for finding less abundant but larger crabs in the Beaufort versus more abundant smaller crabs in the Chukchi Sea.
So don't know whether it's food resources, it's temperature, or anything else like that?
Right. It could be a suite of things. It could be related to temperature. It could be related to snow crabs make large migrations. In the Bering Sea, we know that they are separated spatially based on sexes. So you find large males in different locations than small males. You find mature females in different locations than immature females or small females. And it may be a case that we're seeing males migrate out of the Chukchi Sea around the corner to the Beaufort Sea for deeper waters.
That sounds like hundreds of miles, though, right?
It's quite a trek.
Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the sampling devices that we have here on the stage. Dr. Muter, there's one tube here, and I wonder if you could explain this. It's, from what I understand, it's a CTD bottle. What is that?
Yeah, so this is a bottle that we used to collect water samples at different depths, and so you may remember the picture earlier of what we call a CTD rosette. That's actually a set of electronic instruments in the center that measure conductivity, temperature, pressure, We have a fluorometer on there that can be used to estimate the chlorophyll content of the water. So those are all electronic instruments in the center, and then around those electronic instruments there's a series of bottles like this that hold, I don't know how much water, but quite a bit of water each. And these bottles are mounted like this, and they open on both ends, the top and the bottom, and that's secured so they stay open while the instrument is lowered into the water. So we lower it to a certain depths where we would like to get a water sample, and then we can electronically flip a switch and close the bottle at that depth, and then we get a water sample at that depth and we bring it back to the surface. And then the scientists fight over the volume of water that we can collect in these bottles, and basically fill up smaller bottles, 100 milliliters or 200 milliliters each, depending on what they want to do with the water for different analyses. And some of that's done on board. Some of the filtering is done on board, for example, to measure chlorophyll content. And a lot of it is shipped back, either frozen or chemically preserved, shipped back to the lab for other analyses later on.
We also have another video of the CTD as it appears on deck, and also as it's being lowered into the water. What are some of the things that may be analyzed when it's frozen and shipped back for analysis by somebody on shore?
So primarily nutrient content, because we're interested in how productive these waters are, which of course depends on, nutrients are one of the most important things for fueling the production. The phytoplankton need light, nutrients, and water, plenty water there, plenty light there in the summer if the ice is gone, but we don't really know how many nutrients are available, and so we measure the nutrient content, things like nitrate, nitrite, ammonium, silicate, phosphate, and other things.
And Lauren Devine, there was also some sampling that you took part in. How did that sampling occur? Can you explain a little bit about that and some of the equipment that you used?
Yep, absolutely. So there are actually 2 boats out on the water at one time sampling different locations, and we have to use different gear. There's some gear I think we might get to in a little bit. There's the pelagic and the midwater trawls, which collect things out of the water column, and then I was working with the bottom trawl. So they work kind of the same way. You release them off the back of the boat. There's all kinds of instrumentation that gives us an area sampled, and the bottom trawl collects things off the bottom of the ocean. It's all collected into the back of the net. You haul that up, and then there's a lot of sorting that goes on. We sort through and divide all of each species of sea star and each crab, hermit crabs, and all of the snow crabs. And then there's a lot of counting, sorting, weighing that goes on so that we can get information about all of these different things. For the pelagic trawl and the midwater trawl, you can actually see here the fish swimming through, and there's instrumentation that gives you the amount of water going through, and here's a very muddy bottom trawl. You basically pull the bottom of the net and everything comes out onto the table. It's heavily rinsed. We get kind of jealous of the pelagic guys because they're not getting nearly as muddy, but we smile anyway.
And so basically what's being done here is everybody just sorting them out into different species, that sort of thing?
Everybody's sorting them out into different species, and we try to get as fine resolution as we can, so everybody's getting trained kind of at the same time on different species. There's a lot of learning that goes on the boat. I work with snow crabs, but I learned a lot about all of the different species of clams and shrimp and euphausids and all kinds of stuff.
And we don't, if I may add to that, we don't always know what things are, and we can bring it back, or we can bring voucher specimens back for identification in the lab or by other experts that can identify them later.
And what are some of the more unusual things that you can recall spotting or collecting that you discovered later was something unique or unusual for that area?
On the part of the cruise that I was on, we didn't necessarily find a new species, but we found a lot of, for example, sculpin in the midwater or surface trawl different sculpins that I didn't actually know had juvenile stages in the water column, because usually they on the bottom, like this one here.
Oh, those were sculpin that
Those
we
were
just
sculpin,
saw.
yeah, and they're usually on the bottom, but the young ones are actually up in the water column.
Dr. Farley, let me ask you a little bit about the zooplankton and the relationship to salmon. It was my understanding that fatter zooplankton prefer colder water. So why is the salmon abundance, why does that appear to be up in warmer conditions?
One of the things about salmon, they're very unique. Of course, they're spending part of their life history in freshwater, and then they're spending most of their life history in growth out in the marine environment. And when they enter that marine environment, that first year, there are typically 2 critical periods that they need to get through. And the first one is the first 40 days, where they need to grow real fast. And salmon grow best when it's warmer water and highly productive. And if they grow fast, they can swim faster and escape predation. So that's that first critical period. The next critical period is that first winter at sea, where they're spending that time during summer feeding on the zooplankton or even other smaller fish, where they're still growing, but they're also trying to lay down fat. So usually towards the end of the summer growth season, they're starting to lay down fat, and that fat layer helps them make it through winter. But still, how the ecosystem sets up, this question really gets towards the kind of dynamics that we're seeing in the southeastern Bering Sea versus what's in the Arctic. We see real shifts in the zooplankton community and the level of energy in that community in relation to how that feeds fish, depending on if it's warm or cold. But in the Arctic, we've got ice there every year, so typically it's a pretty cold environment, at least at depth. It might still be pretty warm in the surface waters, but at depth it's still cold.
Okay, and then we also have an animation of another animation of currents and winds. But does that kind of depend also on the terrain and the seasonality and where the currents are going at a particular time of year?
Well, as Franz pointed out early on, we have several currents that are flowing north up into from the Bering Sea through the Bering Strait up into the Chukchi Sea, and that summer flow can be quite extensive, and a lot of the nutrients and the zooplankton that are going to be feeding fishes that are up in the Chukchi are coming with those currents, and so is heat's being brought up from the Bering Sea up there. And those currents can change periodically based on the amount of wind. So if you see heavy storms coming and blowing from the west or down from the north down south, those northward currents can change, and that can really shift the type of dynamics that you're seeing on the shelf. You can get water coming from the Beaufort Sea Basin that gets upwelled up into the Chukchi Shelf at times, depending on the wind, and that'll drive different production.
We also have a video of the zooplankton, and I know we saw a snapshot in your presentation. If we can bring up that there we go. How big are these little guys?
Yeah, they're real small. So this looks like little euphausiids, real small.
And that's typical food for salmon, for other fishes like herring, sand lance.
Yeah. So these zooplankters would have been captured using one of these nets right here, the bongo net that I have behind me. So that's one of the nets that we deploy. It is deployed obliquely, so we start at the surface. We obliquely tow it from surface down to almost the bottom, and then bring it back up at about a 45-degree angle. And that helps you sample throughout the water column, and we catch small zooplankton species like this.
We also have a few pictures of the bongo net as it's being deployed here, if we can bring that up. The mesh on these nets, they're different, right?
Yeah, we have different size meshes for on the bongos. This has smaller mesh, so that catches smaller zooplankton. And this net back here behind me has larger mesh nets, so we get larger zooplankters. And that helps us understand the food that's within the water column, looking at small through the large size fractions.
How far do you usually tow them up and down in the water column?
It depends on the depth. So we typically go between surface down to about 5 meters off the bottom.
And these smaller mesh sizes have a smaller opening because they tend to get plugged up easily when there's a lot of production in the water column, and that's in part why we also use larger nets to kind of capture the larger larger fraction, and all the catch is eventually concentrated in this what's called a cod end that can then be taken off and rinsed down and poured in a bottle for analysis in the lab.
Dr. Kulitz, what do some of the common species, what do the common species of seabirds, what do they feed on up there?
Well, as I mentioned, some of the most abundant birds up there now, at least out at sea, they don't breed in the area, but are the auklets. We have 3 species of auklets, and then the shearwaters, and they all eat, the smaller auklets will eat copepods, the larger auklets will eat more krill, that's the euphausids. Even the larger bodied thick-billed murre will eat the krill a lot. The shearwaters will eat krill. They also eat a lot of the fish. They eat the sand lance, capelin, the juvenile herring. These are more like the kittiwakes and the puffins and murres, common murres. So we like to look at all the birds because they're sampling different parts of the ecosystem that way. And not only different types of animals, but also at different depths. Some of them can only feed at the surface, and they're very dependent on certain currents and fronts that bring the prey up towards the surface where they can get to it. And that's why these things like the different, when you get a periodic push of Beaufort water coming up, say the Barrel Canyon, it'll create a nice little area of concentrated prey, and you might get a lot of shearwaters coming in there. So the birds are moving around following these different concentrations of prey, and they're feeding all throughout the
Any
water.
unusual findings or surprises when it comes to that as far as where they're going to get their food?
Yeah, one of the surprises for us was how many crested auklets we saw up there off of an area called Hannah Shoal in the northwestern part of our study area. Again, these auklets don't breed in the Chukchi. They breed in the North Bering Sea and all the way down in the Aleutians. And we know now from tag birds, we thought they must be coming from way down south early in the year, like July, when the other birds are still raising chicks in the North Bering Sea. It was 600 kilometers from their colony. They can't be going that far to feed while they're raising chicks. So what was happening is the birds finished their breeding earlier in the Aleutian Islands, and then they go all the way up into the Chukchi. So they're going like 1,000 kilometer to feed up in this area of the Hannah Shoal, and it's because there's a huge concentrated mass of prey there, and they're also molting during that time. We're finding they're flightless, so they're kind of vulnerable. And so they need an area where there's not only few predators, but a lot of food, and they don't have to go far to find it. We're finding a lot, as I said, more plankton feeders, but also we're getting other species that didn't used to come up there a lot, like ancient murrelets all the way from, and Kittless's murrelets all the way from the Gulf of Alaska or along the Aleutian. They all come up there to feed, so it's got to be a rich area. And part of what they're finding, looking at the plankton and fish, is that they're not only large prey items for their species, but they're also energy dense. So it's worth their time to go up there, apparently, all that distance to feed on these very rich prey. And I have to add, we also have found the odd species like short-tailed albatross, which first sighting was in 2011, the first sighting of an albatross in the Arctic ever. So that was exciting.
And that video that we showed earlier, that one of the slides there was a snowy owl. Was that unusual?
It's not that unusual in the spring. No, I've been out in the springtime when you're in the ice there. They fly out over there quite a lot. So as the ice is breaking up, you get fewer sightings like that. But yeah, they're out there probably for the. We actually get passerines out there over the ice, but probably for the sea ducks that come out there.
Lauren Devine, what do snow crab feed on, and what kind of species feed on snow crab?
Snow crab feed on everything and anything. We did find differences. We know about, from previous studies, what snow crab feed on in the Bering Sea. They feed on worms, polychaete worms, that live on the bottom, and they make little calcium tubes to live in. And snow crabs just kind of break them apart and eat on those. And very small clams. So we know, walrus and ducks and stuff can feed on large beds of clams, but snow crabs are feeding on very small clams. They also feed, in the Beaufort Sea, they feed on a little bit different prey items than in the Chukchi Sea, and that's probably because in the Chukchi we see, again, a lot of production is leading to a lot of different species in the community, and that looks different on the floor in the Chukchi than it does on the floor in the Beaufort Sea. So snow crabs are eating what's available in both locations, but it looks a little bit different based on where those crabs are found. But again, clams, polychaete worms, and fish when they can scavenge them, and other snow crabs a lot in the Chukchi Sea.
How about marine mammals? Do they feed on snow crab a lot?
Yes, so bearded seals feed on the bottom. There's been a few reports of snow crab coming out of walrus stomachs. They're food for a lot of the benthic fishes that occur up there. The Chukchi Sea has a lot of different flatfish and benthic fish like sculpins that we saw earlier, and they're all feeding on snow crab.
And then, of course, you also have walrus and bears as well. That
And
might
naturally those fishes are feeding other organisms that work all the way up to our charismatic marine mammals.
Now, Dr. Muter, while we queue up a video here of saffron cod, I wonder if you could explain the differences between Arctic cod and saffron cod. I know you showed it earlier in the slide where it looked like saffron cod had a lower fat content than Arctic cod. Can you explain more about the differences between the two?
Yeah, that's one of the differences. So they have differences in distribution. Typically, the Arctic cod are a little further offshore in deeper waters, and saffron cod are closer to shore. Near the coast, and actually they are subsistence food for some of the coastal communities that harvest them under the ice or in open water during the summer. The Arctic cod, as I showed, have a really high energy content. They're very fatty. Saffron cod, not so much. They're not as good a food item for other species. And then maybe importantly, Arctic cod are really cold adapted. They grow in very cold conditions in very cold water, and they grow very well. They outgrow other cod fishes like saffron cod, like Pacific cod, like walleye pollock. They grow much faster than those at very cold temperatures. But as soon as the temperature increases to about 5 degrees Celsius, or though maybe 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, all these other species, including saffron cod, outgrow Arctic cod. They grow much faster at those warmer temperatures. So we think in a warming ocean that saffron cod and these other cod fishes actually have an advantage over Arctic cod. So we may, for that reason, in some areas see declines in Arctic cod and increases in these other cod species.
Now, Arctic cod, it's more prevalent even in commercial quantities on the other side of the Arctic, is that right?
Yeah, there are some. So there's actually high concentrations of Arctic cod in the Canadian Beaufort Sea, although it's not exactly clear, what the actual total biomass is. But there is a small commercial fishery in the Bering Sea off of Norway, a Russian fishery, and they fairly conservatively managed. It's a fairly small quota, and it mostly is shipped to the prisons in Russia, according to one of the scientists from Murmansk.
Dr. Farley, what kind of effect is the retreating sea ice having on the phytoplankton and the zooplankton populations?
A lot of the retreating sea ice effect on some of those lower trophic levels is really occurring down in the Bering Sea, so down in the southern Bering Sea. Ice also plays a large role down there when ice is prevalent in the winter and spring in the southern Bering Sea. We tend to see cold water species of phytoplankton and zooplankton that tend to have higher lipid. When it's real warm, like it has been lately in the Bering Sea, there hasn't been a lot of ice making it down very far into the southern Bering Sea in the wintertime or in the spring. And when we see back-to-back years of warming, we see a real shift in the ecosystem where the zooplankton species become more subarctic and they have lower fat content. So a lot of the ice dynamics right now are happening in the southern Bering Sea, but we know up in the Arctic we get ice every year. And so it's pretty cold still up in the Arctic, and it'll probably remain cold, at least from the scenarios that we saw from the climate scenarios into the late century.
We talked a little bit earlier about this being a benchmark. Is it too early to start using this research as kind of a way to measure climate change in the Arctic? Dr. Meter?
Yeah, we certainly are already documenting and seeing a lot of changes, particularly in the physical system, in the ice cover. You know, we have records of ice going back a long time, decades, and then also the satellite record since the 70s. So we know there's been large decreases in the amount of multi-year ice. There have been changes in the timing of the melting, so the ice melts earlier in the spring and refreezes later in the fall. So the summer season, open water season has been extended. Temperatures are warmer, so all of those changes have been documented. How that affects the biological system is not quite as straightforward. There have been a number of changes that have been documented, including some shifts in distribution, more warmer water species moving north, some changes in abundance of some species that do better in warmer conditions and cold conditions. But that piece of the puzzle we're really just trying to figure out, because we don't have long time series or long records of observations for a lot of the biological components of the system. So we're still trying to figure that out. But the idea behind this study and other studies was to establish a benchmark now so we can go back in the future and compare conditions then to what we have observed now.
And Lauren Devine, why are we hearing about this research and these findings now? I mean, this research was done in 2012 and 2013. Why 3 years later?
Absolutely. As we mentioned earlier, this was a big team and everybody had their own piece. You know, I worked on snow crab, but to really be integrated and to tell this story takes a little bit of time, and we're actually spending very little time on the vessel. So everything that we collect, it's a mad rush, honestly, on the boat to collect as much data as possible, and then we take all of those samples back to the lab, and there's a considerable amount of prep work and time to process those. And so after you do all of that work, you receive, you know, Excel files and sheets of data, and then there's all of the time to interpret that and to really tell the story, and to look at those data and kind of think about and talk with other people and other scientists about, you know, what is going on, what do you think these data are saying? And so that whole process takes time, and throughout the project, you know, we had cruises in 2012 and 2013, and from then on, people have been actively publishing, presenting at conferences. A lot in the scientific community, and it just takes a little bit of time to really tell the good story.
Is this data proprietary? Is it going to be stuck on some agency or university server stuck away somewhere, or is this open to the entire scientific community?
We're trying to make it available to anybody who is interested, and that is happening through a system that's been set up for that purpose, the Alaska Ocean Observing System. And so eventually, some of the data are already available. They're certainly available to those who ask, other scientists, and eventually it will all be publicly available through the website.
Now, Dr. Farley, is Arctic ice done and over with, or is there another step or another phase to the project?
We're happy to report we just received funding to do Arctic Ice Phase 2 through the North Pacific Research Board. The components there are communities, so when we're talking about long-term change, we need to talk to the communities and what they're seeing locally. And they're also going to be funding the University of Alaska Fairbanks to do some of the spring component. A lot of what you saw here was late summer, early fall. The Alaska Fisheries Science Center is going to continue to do that gridded survey that Franz showed earlier in the late summer, fall. And that helps us to integrate some of the community knowledge, the spring and late summer, to try to understand, at least for 2 years, we're going to have probably 2 field seasons in 17 and 18, to see if we can't capture another moment like we saw in 2007 when it was really warm and saw some real changes in the ecosystem, at least for salmon.
How much was the funding for the first phase of the project for 2012 and 2013, and how much is the current phase, or the new phase?
Well, how much did we get? We got about $6 million, I believe, for Phase 1, and for Phase 2, the North Pacific Research Board is funding about $7.5 million of it, and there's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is funding another $2 million, And then there's some funding coming from outside organizations and in-kind funding from NOAA.
And one of the funders is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, right?
Yeah.
Why that?
They're interested. Obviously they're in charge of the lease sales up in the Beaufort and the Chukchi, and this information helps them with their environmental impact statements.
So the other EIS.
The other EIS,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's all the time that we have. Special thanks to Dr. Franz Muter, Dr. Kathy Kulitz, Dr. Ed Farley, and Lauren Devine for their explanation of their research as part of the Arctic EIS project, or Arctic ICE. You've been watching Below the Surface, diving deep into the science of maritime change in the Arctic. I'm Matt Miller. Thanks for joining us.
You've been watching a conversation with scientists involved in the Arctic EIS project, produced for broadcast in collaboration with 360 North and with funding support from the Alaska Community Coastal Impact Assistance Program through the Alaska Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This program was recorded June 1st, 2016 at 360 in Juneau.